Hello everybody, today's lesson is on the League of Nations and today it's on exam question technique and practice. If you haven't already done the knowledge for the League of Nations, please go back and make sure you do that before you tackle this. You can't tackle exam questions until your knowledge is really solid. So in terms of our focus today, we're going to be looking at a specific knowledge question. When we did our work on the Treaty of Versailles, now that seems like quite a long time ago now, we did loads of work on source questions. We did lots of those usefulness questions, those 12-mark questions. We did quite a bit of those 4-mark source questions where it might have been source A is critical of the Treaty of Versailles. How do you know? So our source questions, we've already had quite a bit of practice. So what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on a question we haven't looked at all today so far in the course. We're going to look at question 3. Now question 3 is an 8-mark exam question. I'm going to use 3 examples of that today. So question 3 is a write an account of. So as it says here in this question, what you are doing is you are demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of a sequence of events. So you're going to be looking at potentially an event, what happened and what its consequences were. You need to try and think about 2 steps of the sequence. So it might be looking at the causes of what happened, and then the second paragraph might be on the consequences, making sure that you link everything back to the question and saying how it led to something happening. Usually you'd be answering this in 2 paragraphs in around 10 minutes. The first example of this kind of question is this one here. Write an account of how Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia led to an international crisis. So we're focusing on the invasion of Abyssinia and how that led to an international crisis. Of course, we're looking to try and gain 8 marks at 4 marks per paragraph. So at 2 paragraphs, it's quite simple in this kind of event. We can look at, well, what were the causes of the invasion, what actually happened during that invasion, and what were the consequences, really focusing on the League actions and the Italian actions as well. So the first part of this would be to tackle, well, what happened with the invasion? What was the cause of it? So you'd need to be thinking about, well, why did Mussolini invade Abyssinia at this point? You can't avoid at this point the depression and how badly Italy had been affected. And you'd start off by talking about that in your first paragraph. You might talk about him trying to divert public attention away from the problems that he had at home, but also to gain extra natural resources in order to help bolster the failing Italian economy. You might also talk about revenge for earlier incidents. In 1896, Italians had been humiliated and beaten by the Abyssinians. So part of the invasion was about that. You might also talk, of course, at this point about what happened at the watering hole. That's what this first paragraph needs to focus on. So the second paragraph will be focusing on the consequences. So you'd be thinking about things such as the suggestion of giving land to Italy, those partial economic sanctions that we talked about in the last lesson. Of course, that planned Hall of Al Pact between the British and the French, trying to hand over most of Abyssinia to Italy, the full invasion of the country, which Mussolini decided upon because he decided that he wasn't going to get stopped, and then the real lack of League reaction and how that undermined and helped to finish off the League of Nations and, of course, therefore led to an international crisis. The first paragraph, of course, you're going to link it back to being an international crisis because the League had to get involved in this incident between the 2 countries. This is the kind of answer that we would like you to be working towards. So what I've done is I've put a Word version of this on to show my homework so you can print it out as an example. If you don't have the ability to print, do not panic. You might want to write the answer out, or you could just jot down some of the main points that the answer makes so that you've got an example, so that when you're doing your own answers as this lesson moves forwards, that you actually can see, well, how much does a paragraph need to contain? What kind of things do I need to be writing down? So let's have a look at this answer together. So remember, what we're looking at is we're looking at how the Abyssinian incident led to an international crisis. So we start off by looking at how Italy had been devastated by the Depression. Mussolini needed to divert the public's attention away from problems at home. So Abyssinia was all about that deflection. Mussolini also needed access to vital raw materials. So the Great Depression has had a massive impact, needing to make sure that the public stayed on his side and that Italy could get the goods they needed from abroad. As a final bonus, an invasion of Abyssinia would give Italy revenge for their humiliation and defeat against the Abyssinians in 1896. That was an upsetting and humiliating defeat for the Italians. It was very unexpected. Therefore, a small incident at a watering hole at Walwal was blown out of proportion and turned into a crisis. So we've got our first kind of looking at going back to the question here. We're looking at a crisis developing. So we've kind of seen why it's happened, why Mussolini's taken the actions he has, and then we're seeing why it's turning into a crisis. Around 30 Italian soldiers had been killed, and Mussolini demanded a slice of Abyssinia as compensation. So again, we can see how the incident is beginning to get blown out of proportion. The League failed to act decisively, and this led to an international crisis. So our second paragraph is going to be linked to that. It's going to show what the League actually did or didn't do and how the crisis then spirals out of control. The League set up a commission in February 1935. So we already know that an incident has taken place. It didn't report though until September, and it suggested giving part of Abyssinia to Italy. Mussolini rejected the plan and invaded Abyssinia. So we can already see the crisis getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The League banned arms sales and they put sanctions on things such as rubber and metal. Importantly, it did not close the Suez Canal or ban oil and coal sales. In December 1935, news leaked out of the Hoare-Laval Pact. Now, this was a secret plan by Britain and France to give most of Abyssinia to Italy. This completely undermined the League. This is where it's becoming more and more of an international crisis because the League's very reputation is being damaged. By May 1936, Mussolini had completed the conquest. In June, Haile Selassie, who was the Emperor of Abyssinia, went to the League of Nations. He was ignored. This deepened the international crisis as the League was now effectively dead as a peacekeeping organisation. So what this answer contains is lots and lots of information about what happened, but also a clear eye on the question and a clear link back to why this led to a crisis. So that is our first example of how you would answer this kind of question. So with this second example, this is where I'm going to ask you to do a little bit more. So this question is write an account of how the Great Depression led to an international crisis. And in order to make sure you're successful in this question, your paragraphs would focus on two things. The first thing that you might focus on is what happened with Japan and Manchuria. So hopefully stuff that we know about well. And the second would be on what we already talked about in that first example, on what happened with Italy and Abyssinia. But this time you're only writing one paragraph on each of those two incidents. You've got to be careful and not go into too much detail, but also make sure that you're linking it to the Great Depression and international crisis. So in a moment or two, I'm going to get you to pause this PowerPoint, pause this narrated YouTube clip, and I want you to have a go at writing this paragraph. You, of course, can use your notes from yesterday and any revision materials that you've got on Japan and Manchuria. You don't have to write this off the top of your head. And I would like you to do it in just 5 minutes. So write an account of how the Great Depression led to an international crisis. So your first paragraph is going to be all about the impact on Japan and Manchuria. So first of all, we're going to think about, well, what was the effect of the Depression on Japan? Well, of course, they relied on foreign trade, and that completely stopped. Remember that the Japanese main export was silk. That's a luxury item, and they no longer were able to export the volume of that they needed to pay for the things that they needed for their population. Their land was mountainous, a lot of it inhospitable and unable to grow crops on it. So gaining Manchuria was all about gaining food, raw materials, but it was also about the prestige that the Japanese wanted. They saw themselves as a world power, and yet they were really struggling in the Depression. So then you talk about, well, what did this lead to? And what it led to, of course, was the invasion of Manchuria. So you talk about, again, briefly, what happened there. Well, why was this an international crisis? Well, it's an international crisis, of course, because of the failures of the League here. The League did not do what they needed to. They only used moral sanctions, and that failed. And the Japanese got away with the invasion, and that undermined the League. So for 5 minutes, you're going to tell me, well, why did the Great Depression hurt the Japanese? How that led them on to invading Manchuria, and what that invasion looked like, and how it actually harmed the League and led to a greater international crisis. 5 minutes, have a go at that paragraph. Okay, so now I'm going to have a look at the second paragraph. And just like with the first one, I'm going to tell you what it needs to contain. So we're still looking at how the Great Depression led to an international crisis. So in this second paragraph, you're going to focus on Italy and Abyssinia. So a second incident that came out of the Great Depression was the Abyssinian crisis. So just like with the Japanese, the Italians had relied on imports and world trade. The Depression therefore had completely affected the Italian economy. The Italian economy was on the verge of collapse in 1934. Remember that Mussolini wanted to divert that public attention, and he desperately needed to get hold of new raw materials that he wasn't able to in these times of very, very low trading. Of course, what this led to was the invasion of Abyssinia. Of course, they've got the excuse of what happened at the watering hole, but really this was about the Great Depression and the impact on Italy. So you'll focus on, well, what did the Italians do? And then you'll again talk about the mishandling of this by Britain, France, and the League of Nations, and how that delved us into a deeper international crisis. Making sure again that you're only writing for 5 minutes. You're not going to be able to write about every single little thing to do with the incident, but you should remember to focus on, well, how did the Great Depression lead to Italy being in trouble? What did the Italians do to try and get themselves out of trouble, i.e. invading Abyssinia? And why did this lead to problems? Why was this an international crisis? By focusing on the lack of action by other nations. 5 minutes, have a go. The final challenge is one where we want you to have a go at this on your own. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to help you. It doesn't mean that I've not got lots of things that are going to be there to make you do the answer, but I'm not talking you through each of the paragraphs in the way that I did with question 1 and question 2. So this time round, the question is asking you to write an account of how failures of the 1920s undermined the League. So the key things that we're looking at here are the failures in the 1920s and the impact on the League, so how they undermined and made the League less credible at this point. So on Show My Homework, I've attached this knowledge sheet. You've already got this. You probably got this stuck into your exercise book already from when we looked at the League action in the 1920s. But just in case you haven't got it, or you've mislaid your book for the time being, or you've got your book in the classroom, whatever it is, I've reattached it so you've got the key information that you need. You've got the ability to answer the question now because you've got the skills. So all that you're doing in this final question is you're going to tell me about some of the failures of the 1920s. Well, there's a number of examples here in terms of what the League wasn't able to do. And in fact, there's 2 main examples of where the League failed. And these 2 main examples are in Vilna and Corfu. So in this answer, in order to be able to write an account of how the failures of the 1920s undermined the League, you talk about and you discuss those 2 incidents. You tell me, what happened in Vilna? What was the argument about? Why was there a bit of a crisis? And why did this undermine the League? So what did the League do or not do? Did people listen to the League of Nations? Did people take on board what they said? Well, it's a failure, so probably not. So you've got to talk about what the League wasn't able to do and the impact that that probably had on the League of Nations. So you do that in your first paragraph on Vilna, and then your second paragraph is what happened between the Greeks and the Italians in Corfu. So again, you tell me what happened in this incident. And this incident's a little bit more complicated, but all of the information is there on the sheet. And then you tell me why the League action, or again lack of action, why that led to the League being undermined and seeming to be a failure. So 2 paragraphs. One is all about what happened in Vilna and how that undermined the League. One is all about what happened in Corfu and how that undermined the League. That is all you need to do, please. So hopefully by this point, You've achieved quite a lot in this lesson. You've probably got that model answer from the first question, all about what happened in Abyssinia. Hopefully you've written those 2 paragraphs about both Abyssinia and Manchuria for question 2. And hopefully you've done that question on the 1920s. What do you need to make sure that you have done by the end of this week for history? Well, number 1, make sure you've prepared for that quiz and had a go at it. You need to make sure that you've got at least 70%, but hopefully 100% by the end of this week. You also need to make sure that from that first lesson where we were talking through the knowledge, that you've made some form of revision materials, be that flashcards, a mind map, a revision clock, whatever it is. You might have just made notes in your exercise books. So make sure that that is done. Once you've done that, I'd like you to make sure that you have sent your teacher your work. Anything that you've done today, for example. So it doesn't matter if we don't have a copy of your flashcards or whatever. We don't need to see that revision because we can tell that you revised the knowledge through the quiz. What we do need to see is things from this lesson. So those 2 paragraphs that you did for question number 2 and the full answer that you did for question number 3 today. So all of that stuff, whatever you've done, send it to your teacher. Now, if you've handwritten it, of course, you can take a photo of it on your phone and you can send it via Show My Homework or via email. Or if you've done it electronically, of course, you can send it straight to your teacher via email or via Show My Homework. But it's really important that you send stuff in. That way we can give you feedback and tell you how you're doing. Thanks ever so much, and we'll see you next week.